بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So continuing our lessons on Islamic parenting, we stopped last week in the discussion about the circumcision of a child, particularly that of the boy. And we mentioned that that is one of the four major things that should be done for the child on the seventh day of their birth. And the scholars, they mention that when it comes to circumcision for the boy, that the ruling is that of obligation, and it's wajib. And the wisdom behind it can be looked at or can be found both from a health perspective and a religious perspective. But for whomsoever is not able to have the circumcision done on the seventh day, then they can do whenever it is easier for them. For example, if it is not easy to book a doctor on that day, then they can book it the day after or before or after that. All of this is permissible, as the permanent committee mentioned that doing it on the seventh day is merely recommended or sunnah, not wajib. But the active circumcision, that is Islamic obligated for the children, for the boys. And the ulama, the scholars, when they talk about the hikam and the fawaid, the benefits and the wisdom behind it, they mention it on both angles, from the religious benefits, and they look at it from the health side. And so from the religious benefits is that of cleanliness, of tahara, for circumcision helps the child not to have any impurities on their body or to accumulate any impurities or bacteria or any kind of sicknesses later coming. So purity and cleanliness, specifically because Islam is a religion of nadhafa and purity. And that's one of the arguments Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah mentions. And when it comes to the health perspective, then there are so many, right? And it's particularly some benefits for the child, right, to protect the young boy and later the adult from any types of different diseases and cancers that can be a result of not being circumcised. And obviously, there are many other factors in place. So some of the Islamic scholars and researchers like Dr. Ali Al-Bar, who's a well-known Islamic researcher, professional, who contributes to the research that's given by the Majma' al-Fiqhi, the Islamic Fiqh Council. He mentions, right, in his book, on our essay on khitan, on circumcision, a lot of the benefits. And in today's world, if you go and look at the literature, the scientific literature about the health benefits of circumcision for boys, you find an array of research, but we have to be very careful and very honest that there's a Western position, or you may say a sizable amount of people and doctors and researchers who are of the view that male circumcision is little to no benefit. Right, even right now, I was looking at before in preparation for today's lesson, some of the newer studies in 2022 that indicate that there is little to no benefit, like medically, medically sound evidence that circumcision helps the boys from different types of cancers or different kinds of diseases or urinary tract, right, infections, etc. And ultimately, you find this discussion, this debate, been raging a long time, right, in the medical community. And both pieces of evidence are there, right? Literature on both sides, right? Some reviews are suggesting goes back to the practices of the parents and their own cultural, religious, and decisions for the child. Others, they say, no, there is medical benefit. And it's true, there is medical benefit. But the studies, obviously, the more recent studies, and I think this is something very important to mention, that in Western culture, particularly the Christian culture, they're not very big on, although they used to be, but not anymore, so much on the circumcision, where the Jewish community, the Muslim community, we continue to circumcise, even though something like 70% of Americans are circumcised, right? Or something like 50 or more, right, percent in other regions, right? But America is doing something up to 70% people, right? And obviously, it does go back to the Christian, Judo-Christian background, but also we know in the secular atheistic world that circumcision is considered not important or not even beneficial. They may even make arguments in favor of freedom, right? The child should not be coerced to anything. But if you look at the data, you see that there is a benefit, even if someone were to say it's minuscule, right? Because most of the causes of these kind of harms, right? These kind of cancers and these kinds of infections are due to behavioral issues, right? So people who are being promiscuous, people who are having multiple partners and being, reckless. True enough, 100% we agree that is also a contributing factor, but you cannot deny the fact that there is benefit. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is alim hakim. But the ulama, when they talk about circumcision, they don't only limit its benefit to the health benefit. And that's important as a conversation for the Muslims, not to reduce, right, the circumcision only to its medical benefit, because then you're going to run into this large body of work or this kind of raging discussion amongst the medical community. We acknowledge there is health benefits. And that's why the CDC, right, the Disease Center for Disease Control, they continue to recommend circumcision for males, right, and in America, right, and so that's that's one example of a big organization continue to mention it, and also the other things like HIV risks and lowers HIV risk, etc. So you can see this kind of data, but in case someone were to say, well, right, if the health benefits are not as pronounced, right, isn't it something which should be maybe why is it obligatory then? And we say that our scholars, they mentioned that circumcision is not rooted just in, right, the health benefits, but also the religious benefits. And this here is a beautiful statement. Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentions in his newborn baby guide, Tuhfat al-Mawdud, where he says that circumcision is a mark for entering the religion of Ibrahim, which conforms to one interpretation of the saying of Allah, Sibghat Allah. ومن أحسن الله ومن أحسن الله ومن أحسن السبغة. يعني Sibghat Allah, what it means is that Allah's subhanahu wa ta'ala's literally the dye that's been made, or that's been the mark that's been done for Allah. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says Sibghat Allah, right? This is the marking, the religion, the literally the dye for Allah. وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ مِنَ اللَّهِ سِبْغَةً. And who is better in religion? And here Sibgha can also be marking. What is better than the marking of Allah's? And we are his worshippers. Here he says, Ibn Qayyim says it means circumcision. This is one of the tafsirs of the scholars of the Salaf. So here we take a benefit that is a continuous circumcision for the Hanifs, yani Ahlul Tawheed, the Hunafa are those who follow Ibrahim's way, true Tawheed. Kan Ibrahim Hanifan Muslim, he was Hanif, pure Muwahid, pure Islamic monotheist. So circumcision for the Hanifs, yani the Muwahidun, the Muslims, the people of Tawheed, is what was regarded as baptism and christening for the worshippers of the cross. That's a beautiful resemblance and connection to show that in reality, Islam, there is no baptism, rather we have circumcision. And circumcision in many ways has religious benefits, the submission to Allah, right, the commitment to the religion of Allah, that also show that its benefits are not just on the side of the health benefits, although they exist. But in case someone were to run into the different papers and studies that we said that are trying to counter these benefits, we say that it's now reduced, right, to these benefits and these wisdoms only, right? There are many. So that's important to take into consideration. Of course, in the world today, we also understand that in the Western world, they lost that tradition of circumcision for the most part, except for the Muslims and Jewish community who are widely still doing it, although others still do, right? But the rising secularism, godlessness, right, is why you find a lot of scientists who are skeptical about it. But we also have to pay attention to other non-religious groups of people also circumcised despite not being religious, right? So that shows that circumcision isn't just for those who are religious, right? And just shows that there's a reason and benefit for it. طيب, with that being said, now when it comes to the circumcision, a question comes, which is that are we allowed to celebrate this milestone, right? For it is a milestone, right? And it is something which in the past people would do banquets and parties and wala'im, banquets and gatherings and for food after the successful circumcision of the child. And so the Islamic scholars, for the most part, say it's permissible to do such a gathering. And this goes back to what we mentioned some classes ago on the criteria of permissible gatherings. And in the Muslim literature, right, in fiqh, the gathering, the walima or ta'am al-khitan or walima al-khitan was something which the Arab would call al-adhiratu. Al-adhiratu is the name, and other names they give al-i'daru. They have these kind of names for practice where the parents would have a banquet where they invite friends and family to eat to celebrate the successful circumcision of their child. And so something like this, which is any a joyous occasion, it's been something which is permissible to celebrate, because we studied before that as long as something is from the permissible times of occasion, occasions of joy and happiness, and it's not a Eid, and it's not directly imitating the specific practices of the disbelievers, nor is it involved in anything haram in there, then it can be done. And so the Shafi'i and the Hanabila and their madhahib, they both say that it's actually recommended for someone to do it if they're doing it out of gratitude to Allah and they intend to feed their fellow Muslims. They say this is recommended. And that's very fascinating, right, to see that, right, that they went to that extent that they say it's mustahab, although other madhahib just say it's mubah. Ibn Qudama, he writes, rahimahullah, in Al-Mughni, that's for the invitation to food prepared for circumcision in relation to the one doing it, then there is no specific virtue associated with it due to nothing being legislated on it. Then he continues, says, if the doer intended by this gratitude of Allah, the exalted, to feed his brothers, spending on his food and giving out from his wealth, then he's rewarded for that, inshallah ta'ala. And so from this angle, there's nothing wrong with that. And this is important as something to take into consideration, that these kind of occasions, if they arise, somebody can participate, right, in it. And if someone is invited to such a gathering, although I don't think it's very popular on this side of the world, right, then it is permissible, right, to go and to attend, right. In fact, the ulama, the Sahaba and Tabi'un, as Imam Shawkani, he mentions in Al-Awtar, he said it's wajib to attend because it falls to the general invitations when Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, Ijibu da'iyah, and answer the invitation, the one who invites you. So the benefit I wanted to mention behind that is that the circumcision is one of the last of the four things that happen on the seventh day. And so from here on going forward, what is then for the parents to be doing? So now that we mentioned on the seventh day, this point is the fourth of the four things that should be done on the seventh day. So naming the child, shaving the head of the child, right, and then giving that weight in charity, and it's the aqiqah, one of the very important, slaughtering for the child, and now the circumcision for the boy. These four. Now, after this, a parent moves into a stage, right, of parenting where they're going to deal with the everyday life of the child and their guidance. And so it's important to understand that the Islamic legislation, when it comes to parenting and when it comes to dealing with raising children, there are timelines, or you can call milestones throughout, and these are marked by age, and some of them are marked by occasions. And so if we look into the Sharia, we will see, as we just saw right now, a child's firstborn, then there's things to do. And when this day passes, there's things to do. And when it gets around this time, there's things to do. So these kind of milestones, developmental milestones, and religious guidance is very important for the parent to pay attention to, because this will be the vast majority of the active Islamic tarbiyah and right raising the child, which we'll get into now. Right, so Islamic tarbiyah from 0 months of the first year. What is tarbiyah, right? And what does it have to do with, right, our discussion? Well, when we look at Islamic parenting, the terminology, the term, the catch-all phrase for the Islamic for Islamic parenting is at-tarbiyah. At-tarbiyah literally means cultivation, nurturing, uprising or bringing, child rearing. Yeah, it doesn't only have to be specific to children. Right? You can make tarbiyah of anything, right? Make kind of plants, of animals. But when you say tarbiyah, we're talking about the science and the subject matter of raising a child from the time they're born until the time they reach the age of maturity and righteousness, and even after beyond the age of purity, obviously. But at that time, the child obviously is now more independent. So after the seventh day, the celebrations are relatively over for the most part, even though, as I just mentioned, right, there can be occasions where the more celebration is happening and more, congratulations or congratulatory practices are happening. But most cases, now it's the long journey in tarbiyah. Right? Now it's the bulk of our conversation. In this class and these lessons, we'll be talking about what to do, right, in terms of raising the child, the do's and the don'ts, and the advices of the ulama, the guidance. And you'll notice a trend, right, as the child gets older and older, more guidance is there, right, in legislation to accompany the development of that child. And it's beautiful because the Sharia and legislation observes and takes into consideration, right, the development of the child from one stage to another. Understanding that when the child is very, very young, in this case, an infant, they're not very close at all, right, to the age where they have to do the acts of worship. So at that stage, there's less guidance, not guidance, so less guidance, less, let's say, considerations or regulatory laws for that child at that time, and because the child is just young. But as they're getting older and getting closer and getting more developed, by maturing, aging, getting closer to the age of maturity, the age of discernment, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislates in the Quran and the Prophet and the Sunnah things to do. And so we're going to see this qawa'id, their usul, when it comes to tarbiyah. There's practice, principles, and there's practices. It's very important. And this subject of tarbiyah is so important because ultimately this is what the scholars are literally advising us and teaching us and deriving from the Kitab and Sunnah when it comes to parenting, right? So the idea of saying parenting is essentially tarbiyah, and that's what it is, right? And so for us as Muslims, we're trying to raise the children in obedience to Allah, but also have that knowledge, wisdom of the appropriate and best practices. So you can divide Islamic parenting then into kind of two overarching subject areas. One of them is the developmental milestones, a child's advice and guidance from the people of knowledge and expertise and the Salaf and the Quran, Hadith, about how children grow and what are some things to help in their growth. So we can call it maintaining the child's physical, mental well-being. Right. So of course, when a child's first born, that's a major concern, right? Child's healthy, child's okay, they're reaching developmental milestones, and that's obviously that's the biggest concern, obviously, for the newborn and parents alike. But as they get older and they're growing healthy, now the second one is ensuring the child's spiritual well-being, and their faith, their iman, building on their akhlaq, building their aqidah. And so we'll notice that both angles are important. So the Sharia doesn't have negligence in either of these two angles. It's not just focusing on the tarbiyah. Tarbiyah doesn't just focus on the iman and the ruh. It also focuses on jasad, because there's a connection between the body and mind. So you notice that scholars, they talk about, right, how to feed the child, and when to walk the child, and how to speak to the child. Right? What should they say? How to build their emotions, how to make them confident, how to make them leaders. We'll talk about this stuff as we go. But at the same time, how to pray salah, how to fast Ramadan, how to not lie. So why are both angles talked about by our scholars? Because Islam is a holistic, right, religion. It teaches both. As important as parents, right, and as Muslims, that we're aware of this. That a child, in order for it to be complete, we're not only expecting them to be just, doing only the ibadat in terms of the idea that they are well nourished from the iman perspective, but also physically, and we hope for them to have a healthy body and mind. And so both are important responsibilities of parents. Another problem also could arise that if we look at the tarbiyah, we notice in Western tradition and literature on the subject matter of the science of parenting, we notice a lot of focus on the developmental angle, how to keep the body healthy, how the child's mind can grow, how you can help the child develop emotions, good emotional intelligence, and mental health, which is very important. But they make that the objective. Why they forgot the Islamic side, raising this child, and to become what? To become a good Muslim. So we're going to know what tarbiyah is. We need a definition. And here I'm going to give you a definition. We can copy it down, or we can keep it in our mind. What is a tarbiyah? It's very important, because this is where you may see a big problem happens in our community. We mentioned in the beginning the lack of tarbiyah, how dangerous it is for the parents, because if they don't do tarbiyah for the child, they don't cultivate them properly, they will fail the dunya and the akhirah, because they won't get the child to reach the heights that they're supposed to become righteous, which what we want. We want ذرية صالحة, يعني, right? قرة أعين, Allah says, to make them pleasure and the coolness of our eyes. So when we use the term al-tarbiyah too, it carries many meanings, but it's often used to refer to the process of cultivating and upbringing the next generation. Imam al-Munawi, rahimahullah, he writes that the definition of tarbiyah is to build or shape something from stage to stage until level of completion. So literally you move something from on a continuum from one level to the next. That's tarbiyah. You're moving something along a continuum from one stage to another. And what do you notice about that kind of definition? It mimics and also reminds us of the nature of human beings, that we're moving, developing one level to another, from weakness to strength back to weakness. That's human nature. We're going from young to old and back to old again, which we kind of lose our strength. We're going from infancy to toddler to child to, you keep going, right? Well, what's interesting about this, a tarbiyah then can be understood as the Islamic process of raising children and the young generation from stage to stage until they become upright, righteous servants of Allah. And ultimately, that's second level completion. We want them to become people of taqwa. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu qu anfusakum wa ahlikum nara. You believe, save yourselves and your family from hellfire. We want them to be people of taqwa. We want them to be complete in their aql, in their jism, their body, so they can be righteous servants of Allah. They can reach the age of puberty and beyond, healthy, well, and upon Islam. So this is a definition of the linguistic meaning of tarbiyah, but ultimately what is understood by the science of tarbiyah itself. The guidance, the Islamic guidelines, the best practices to get our children to become upright, guided children, contributing to society, benefiting their parents with dunya and akhirah, and everyone else. This is what we want. And so tarbiyah is a science. The ulama, they actually talk about fiqh al-usra, the fiqh of family. Yes, it does exist. And now what we're doing in this subject, at-tarbiyah. This series we're talking about tarbiyah. Islamic parenting is a tarbiyah. Now, the tarbiyah itself, it's not a small task, right? Or some small subjects, very detailed, very deep, because ultimately it deals with the entire, you might say, life or the course of the life of the child, level stage to stage. How far does tarbiyah really go? Right? Because when you think about it, it's like, well, you can talk about children and raising them, and their advices for them for so long, but where is the cutoff? Where do we start? Where do we end? And so when you think about it, it's like, well, human beings don't stop going from one level to another, right? Or we're always traveling stage to stage. Right? Allah said that mankind generally traveling stage to stage in life, right? From one to another until we get to the akhirah. But if you look at books of tarbiyah, like we'll use Ibn Qayyim because it's like the backbone of this entire series, a lot of his work. Ibn Qayyim, rahimahullah, in his book, and he's not the only one, right? And we'll get to this later. What developmental stages do the ulama have written about? Maybe after Ramadan we'll talk about this. Very interesting. If you compare this to family studies and parenting courses, when they talk about different stages of children's life, our ulama in the past divided the child's life into categories as well, like Ibn al-Jawzi, rahimahullah. And I forgot how many categories did he have, 5 or something like this, right? But if you look at Ibn Qayyim's book, for example, his book, he begins from all the way from the beginning, which is the conception, right? So the child's birth, and he actually started from birth, right? And he goes all the way until puberty. Right? So what's interesting is Ibn Qayyim, he goes all the way there, and on one subject that he actually talks about the development of the child, right, inside the womb. But the cutoff of Ibn Qayyim's work ultimately ends up until a child reaches the age of puberty, right? When they have to now make, find a job and decide to, find a calling in life. And so ultimately maturity seems to be the cutoff. It mentions here from the age of 10 until puberty, he's called a teenager and approaching puberty. So Ibn Qayyim goes up until 15. Why 15? Because we know as Muslims that's the cutoff for the puberty. And that's ultimately, the person reached adulthood in Islamic law. So why is this important? When we talk about tarbiyah, then ultimately we want to take a child from before conception all the way until that period where they reach maturity. And inshallah, there will be a state of taqwa and khair to which they then can fend for themselves and they can continue to grow. Of course, parents will always be in their life, but the idea is that the child now is legally responsible for their life and their actions, mukallaf. And that's the point of tarbiyah. Then ultimately, we want to go from pregnancy to puberty. And so obviously beyond that, someone will say, what do you do after that? Because those were the most difficult years, maybe, especially in our societies, from 15 to 18 to 20, 21. This is, these children today, young adults are all over the place. Ultimately, yes, there's still guidance. The Sharia has guidance for all of us. But now you're kind of moving into, advice regarding your own religiosity, your own spirituality. But tarbiyah, right, ultimately doesn't end at puberty, but it's interesting how Ibn Qayyim made set the cutoff. Just want to mention these things. And obviously later we can put in a chart and we can map it, right? So we can see how the ulama, they mention this. But now we know what tarbiyah is. How do you start tarbiyah at 0 months, right? What do you do? What's next? So ultimately, our ulama, as I said before, one of the things that's very interesting, as a child grows, right, throughout the milestones, as they're getting older, they're reaching more developmental milestones, more and more of the spiritual responsibilities appear. And so as a child gets closer to the age of discernment, closer to the age of maturity, you can find more rules and guidance and acts of worship and things they should be doing. But when it comes to the child from now, like 0 months all the way to 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, etc., there is guidance. But more of the focus is on the developmental elements to ensure that the child is developing to reach the age of discernment. And this is an important point to mention. A lot of parents, they need to know this. A child ultimately, right, where a lot of the big changes happen when it comes to their religious and practicing of their ibadat, for example, prayer, recitation of the Quran, memorization of the Quran, schooling, it begins around 7. And we're going to talk about how the scholars have a big discussion about that later. What age do you teach your kid the Quran? But 7 is a big milestone because 7, now a child has discernment, they have tamyiz. Aql, inshallah, is good. The child was risen healthy. The mind is good. The body is healthy. Now they're ready to take on some more tasks. From 7 until 10, as we'll see, is a training period, right, for a lot of the different ibadat, prayer, fasting, and different types of good deeds, talking akhlaq. From 10 now upward, now they really got stuff. And they should be able to pray and fast. They should be having good character, manners, obedience to parents. A lot of things are going to become fixed in terms of habits and practices, and also responsibility that the parents are allowed to take kind of discipline or have some kind of rules, right, for when these things are not being done. And we'll talk more about that later. What do you do when a child at that age is still not fulfilling the milestones, religious milestones? And when you get to 15, then khalas, now you're literally the Karam and Katibin are writing both the good and the bad, right? So what we take from this, from 0 to 1, all up to 7, there is advice from the scholars in the Quran and Sunnah about what the parent should be doing. But so much is more to do with the parent should be doing to help the child develop physically and mentally, and also preparing them for their religious development. And so it doesn't mean then that when a child is 0 all the way to 7, there's nothing to be done. But you notice where more of the advice is lying is on the spiritual development, the physical development, and mental development. Make sure they're healthy, make sure they're well fed, make sure that you're watching out for because this is you're getting them ready. And Allah's rahmah on the child is that He doesn't ask from them that which they can't do. Right, from 0 to all the way to 7. Right, some kids reach discernment even after 7 sometimes, right? But usually some kids reach it earlier at 5. But the idea is like when the kid's that young, it's to play, right, and development and growing. But a parent needs to be careful. Just because they're focusing developmental milestones doesn't mean they ignore the things that the child should be doing, because the child is da'if, weak at that time. They can't help themselves. They need the parent to help them. So our scholars, alhamdulillah, again, focusing on this kind of understanding, they give advice on both ends of the spectrum. Again, Imam Ibn Qayyim, rahimahullah, and he's not the only one. We'll look at some of the advice of the other scholars as we get older, as the child gets older, and we get more into the age where the child is beyond the infancy. We'll add in some of the advices of Imam Ibn Jawzi, Imam Al-Ghazali, Imam Al-Ramli. There's a lot of scholars, right? Others who mention a lot of interesting, very interesting piece of advice. It's very fascinating. But that's in the tarbiyah, right, of the child. But now, 0 months to 1 year, what should the child, what should a parent be looking for? What should they be doing? So number one, let's talk about developmental things. Ibn Qayyim, rahimahullah, for example, in his book, Newborn Baby Guide, he does talk about some of the developmental things. For example, he talks about taking care of the child and the diapers. And it's very, obviously this is something at the end of the book, but it's interesting, right? The Shaykh is talking about that just as much as he talks about other acts of worship and sunnahs. He talks about that. He says the matters of a child's diapers should not be neglected, even if it was a burden, until his body and organs strengthen and he can sit on the ground. And ultimately, even after that, it should be taken seriously. But the idea is, why is that important? Because obviously a parent needs to make sure the child's not going to get any diaper rash or, any kind of, sickness or any kind of issue. And also that the child at that weak stage, right, they do need more and more surveillance. And this is something which the Shaykh mentions alongside many other advices about what to do when the child gets another age. So we do agree that developmental issues are very important. Today, in parenting circles and research into parenting, there is deep discussions about best practices when it comes to these things. And Ibn Qayyim, rahimahullah, writing in the 8th century, so he died 751, so he's in the 8th century. Some of the things that he's mentioning are based on the ijtihad at that time, right? So we spoke about this before, and it's important to take in that consideration. Why? Because some things may change, right? So some of the advice Ibn Qayyim gives at that time may not be the advice that today is considered best practice based on the change in science. Is it wrong, for example, for us to forego Ibn Qayyim's advice, rahimahullah, in relation to what the medical community is saying? Absolutely, it's fine, because Ibn Qayyim didn't say it's Quran and Sunnah, and he didn't say this is the way of the Salaf or this is a religious practice. This is the ijtihad from medical side. And this is important to add that there can be changes, but some of the things Ibn Qayyim, most of what Ibn Qayyim mentions are spot on and very helpful and useful. So we need to take a balanced approach, right? So when it comes to, for example, this point about the diapers, yeah, everyone can agree to that and accept that point. But there are other things that he does mention that can be further analyzed within the milieu of our time and knowledge and the development that we have in terms of the ilm dunya. And this is important. I'll give you one example. Right, Ibn Qayyim talks about on page 279. He talks about the child should not be carried around until they reach 3 months of age or more, due to their recent emergence of from their mother's wombs and their weak bodies. So Ibn Qayyim, he mentions here that it's better not to carry the child around up until they reach the age of 3 months or more. Yeah, and he takes them out and about. And the issue obviously goes back to science. Is it recommended? Is it healthy to take the child outdoor for a walk if it's not severely cold, for example, or severely hot? Right. Of course, if it's very cold and like below -12, you shouldn't, according to experts. And if it's really, really hot, you shouldn't, unless, of course, the child is thoroughly shaded. But the point is that necessarily something which is true now? Well, science says now it's not correct. That there's no evidence to show that you can't carry a child around before the age of 3 months. As soon as the child is born, they're built to be taken around. And so Ibn Qayyim's advice there could obviously be understood in many ways, right? Maybe he's talking about the practice of another meaning of what he's saying could be that maybe it's not good to carry a child all the time. Right? Some of us probably heard that too. That's if you carry a child from day one, you're gonna spoil them. But scientific studies show that you cannot spoil a child. By carrying them. In fact, carrying them is very good. It has benefits for the child. And so from these angles, we can see that if the scientific knowledge and some of these best practices are now running counter to some of the advice of the ulama, then we go with that which is scientific proven, min babin التجربة. التجربة, we already spoke about, it's experimentation. It is one of the ways to learn if something is beneficial or not. So it's important to mention this at this point. Not to obviously discredit the great Imam, rahimahullah, because he's Imam. If he makes jihad, then it's not the most correct. Nowadays, he still gets rewarded. This is, this is no way this is a criticism of the Imam. But for us as people in this era, we need to know these things, right? Because some of the advice we'll see later, we could forego it for something which we find more beneficial. But Ibn Qayyim talks about these things. Let's look at another example. Ibn Qayyim talks about the child being frightened. And this is an interesting one, the child becoming scared. So naturally, children become startled as infants by the slightest of things, right? Or maybe the most innocent of things. For example, loud noises, washing machines, blenders. They become startled by new people, right? New faces, right? Even a stranger or a friend, right, of the family, of the mother or father comes, it scares them. So when a child is scared, they already have a built-in mechanism, right? The more so reflex, where children already are, you can tell that they're, scared, right? They can make a certain, like, kind of as if they're following movement, right? But the point is, when you see this kind of thing, right, from a child, what do you do, right? So Ibn Qayyim actually talks about this, and I think it's very fascinating. He talks about, right? So the moral reflex is what the child gives away. The child is frightened. But what if I don't care? Like, for example, if I'm a parent, I'm not really focused on my child's mental health. Even at that age, yes, even at that age, an infant can internalize trauma. An infant can internalize trauma. So the moral reflex when a child looks like it's grasping for the air and trying to grab as if it's falling, this is a sign it's scared, but also just the fact it's crying, right? When it sees something it's not familiar with. You do not, for example, according to experts, you do not do exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is what we studied in mental health classes, where you try to expose the child to the threat. For example, some children get scared of beards, right? I mean, bearded man could be scary to a child, so who is not the father. So if you go and try to make the child understand this is just a beard, it might really traumatize him or her. So you don't do that. So what does he say? What do you do? The child must be protected from anything that can scare him, such as terrible loud sounds, horrible scenes, and disturbing movements, as they may harm his intellectual capabilities that are weak at this point, which would prevent him from utilizing them when he grows. If he was subjected to such a thing, parents must hasten to counter his effects. Entertain him with what makes him forget. Give him his mother's breast immediately, so that his disturbance goes away and not get imprinted in his memory, making it difficult to remove. And he should be cradled until he falls asleep and forgets about it. This matter should not be treated lightly, for to neglect it is to instill panic and fear in his heart, which will cause him to grow up like this and make it very difficult to get rid of. And this is very interesting. I mentioned this point because now our studies are showing that what he mentioned as a counter effect, for example, breastfeeding the child, cradling him or her, getting them, distracted. This all works. We would say, well, the child, and this is old science, that science in the past would thought that children do not have the capacity to feel, to remember traumatic experiences because their, mind is not developed. But this is not true. And now studies show that when a child is startled or just feeling uneasy or scared, comfort feeding, right, which is to feed a child when he or she is not hungry, just to calm them down, is actually effective. Right, so Ibn Qayyim is right in this angle, and this actually is scientifically supported, right? That because people have the concerns that if you comfort feed a child, you become a human pacifier. This is not good for mothers to do that. You're going to spoil the child, but ultimately you're not. You're not going to overfeed. You're not going to harm. That's actually not necessarily true. But also imagine if now we tell to ourselves, Ibn Qayyim is giving us practical advice about protecting children from their mental health, from fear and startling. What if somebody, for example, this is a bad practice that some parents do, the children get a bit older, they start scaring them for fun. Astaghfirullah al-Azim. Right? And I don't have the time now, but I will play, right, or show one of the statements of one of our contemporary scholars, Sheikh Sulaymaan and others, Mashaykh, talking about the dangers of that practice. With social media now, this has become something some parents think is funny, right? Scare the child and record it, or they put on some scary filters on TikTok or Instagram, Snapchat, whatever, This is totally unacceptable, right? But because now we can realize that when it comes to developmental things, the child's mental health counts and it affects them. And Qayyim mentioned that it can instill panic and fear. And this is actually true. If obviously it doesn't mean that if a child saw something once, they got scared, it's going to become traumatized. No, but imagine a parent doesn't understand that and doesn't really take too much effort to worry about it. Then traumatic experiences like car crashes or traumatic experiences like, I don't know, fighting or violence can be imprinted in a child's mind. Subhanallah Ali, right? And only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. But it's very important to show that at the very least, our scholars are giving us this advice so that we, right, as Muslims and parents are not left to not know these things or not actually being aware of them. But it shows Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah, his advice is practical on that side of things as well. But within his book, from 0 years to 1 year, ultimately, Ibn Qayyim mentions about 5 different things that a parent should be concerned with at that time. And Ibn Qayyim also mentions advice, or doesn't mention necessarily, but it can be mentioned, some spiritual things they should be doing. So for the sake of the time, what I'll do is I just talk about some of the things Ibn Qayyim mentions as a timeline. And we'll also talk about, maybe after next lesson, we can go in detail on each one of them. Because they obviously require some detail. It's not necessarily in order. That's another thing. He kind of mentioned them. Some he mentioned timelines, timings, and others he just mentioned when this happens and you should do this. So let's take a look at just some of the 5 developmental issues or milestones that Ibn Qayyim mentions in and around the first year of an infant's life. So Ibn Qayyim mentions 5 things, from what I counted, that fall into the first year of a child's life, and advice about that. Number 1, he talks about teething, which he says happens around 5 to 7 months. Scientific studies show that it can go, teething happens, a little bit, not exactly, because they say 4 to 7. Some say, a little bit more than that, but Ibn Qayyim is roughly on the right track there. But some say even 3 months it can happen. So Ibn Qayyim gives advice about teething. He gives advice about eating solid food, when time a child should be eating solids, and what to do and how to do that. He gives advice about weaning the child, how to wean the child, the best time to do that and how. He gives advice about walking, right? And not to hasten to get a child to walk before they're ready, because that's not helpful for their health. And lastly, he talks about speaking. So from these 5, you can see Ibn Qayyim talks about, these are some of the major ones, right? You might say these are major developmental milestones for a child from 0 to 1. And there's so many more, right? If those of us can Google and research, child laughing, staring, child mimicking, my parents, using, keeping their neck up, or being able to, before they walk, they can, stand with support, all these things, right? So many. There's the motor skills, the fine motor skills, the language cues, and all this. So there's so many. But the benefit we take is that why is Ibn Qayyim mentioning this advice? So he can also give a practical aid. So the encouragement then is to, and maybe we'll do next time, take each one of these points Ibn Qayyim mentions and kind of analyze them, right? And this advice that he gave, what is it, and how is it till today the best practice according to modern science? But also pay attention to some of them which are really fascinating, like the one where he talks about speaking, right? That a child, when they're ready to speak, they should be told what to say. And the first thing he said they should be saying is La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. That's absolutely correct. Right? And this is beautiful, right? To mention this point that when it comes to speaking, the first thing you want to teach a child to speak is not, even though it might be mama and dada, that might be the first thing they're going to say, but the best thing you want to tell them to say is the shahada. Right? This is the best thing you want them to say. I mean, yeah, they might say something else, but this is best. And so these kind of advices we're going to take a look at in more depth. When it comes to the religious side of things, Ibn Qayyim talks about a lot more of the religious things later on. But what did the ulama advise at the 0 to 1 year period? What should we be doing for our children? So the 2 biggest ones is number 1, dua, right? Making dua for the child. And it's very, very important one. It's extremely beneficial. Dua for the child. And number 2, protecting them from the evil eye. And these points cannot be emphasized enough, that when we look at the period the child's in, this is the time to protect the child. The child's helpless, right? Because they can't make dua. So it's important to make dua for them, seek the refuge for them. Dua can be general, and then there's dua that can be read specifically. So from the angle of the specific, right, but the general, any dua the parent makes themselves for the child, for example, for the good health, for the protection, for etc. For specific dua, then, right, then we know there's a dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam that he used to do for Ismail and Ishaq, and later on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to do that for Al-Hassan wal Hussein. And so, what is that dua for the children? What exactly you're asking? Right. So this dua for the children is you're asking Allah to protect them from any kind of evil eye and from any harm. Hadith is, you can find Hisn Muslim, Hisn Mu'min as well. You can find either any dua book. Hadith Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يعوذ الحسن والحسين. He used to seek protection for Hassan and Hussein, saying, أعوذكما بكلمات الله التامة من كل شيطان وهامة ومن كل عين لامة. I commend you to the protection of Allah, of Allah's perfect words, from every devil and every vermin, it's like a poisonous animal, and from every evil striking eye, evil eye that strikes. And this hadith, this dua al-Bukhari Muslim, is very powerful dua, because now we mentioned number one is dua, and number two, we said evil eye. So here, this dua protects the child from all kinds of things, including the evil eye. So Rasulullah's dua is comprehensive. When we look at our society, we may not notice that that's very, very, very important. Dua, especially from the evil eye, must be read for the children because they can't read it themselves. And that's another thing, not putting the children in the harm of the hasid, which again, we'll talk more about more detail, what the ulama say in detail, but the scholars say you should not, for example, share pictures of a child on social media, taking videos and sharing it to the whole world, people who don't know and may not be the well-wishers. When we know every day we read the Quran and we seek protection from Allah, وَمِن شَرِّ حَاسِدٍ إِذَا حَسَدٍ. Every day we ask Allah to seek refuge from the envy of the envious. But what about our children who are amana? And as scholars say, they are amana. And if you're not going to fulfill the amana by just letting them, anybody see the kids and just pictures of them and put them online, and anyone just with no protection, no dua is made, very dangerous. In fact, it's not only possible a child become harmed physically, mentally. Right? It's even possible, and it's been documented by some of the people knowledge, the children even died. Some have even died due to the evil eye. And they're talking about social media. I'm not talking about someone who came to the house. I'm talking about just from a picture of a child. They didn't even make, no one sought refuge for that child. Allah musta'an. That's one of the greatest masa'ib that can happen. When we talk about general dua of the parent is always answered, especially dua of the mother, because she's so close to the child. But both parents, dua is answered. So it's a beautiful time, from 0 to 1. Make lots of dua for the child, for the aql, for their body, for their success in the akhirah. And it's not something we should take lightly. Again, someone may say, well, what are we going to be making dua for? Because most of the time we're just so happy with the child that they're a blessing, but also they're important we don't forget that we want them to be successful. So dua of the parent is answered, make lots of it. So some of the duas that you can make have to do with what you want for the child, right? So for example, you want the child to be successful. You want the child to, and this is sufficient. Right? You're asking Allah all the time, Allah make him successful. Don't make dua against the child. Obviously, as 0 to 1, no one really does this, but as the child gets older, making dua against the child can be answered. But how about a child who's brand new? No better example than dua of Maryam's mother, right? Hannah. She made dua for Maryam and Isa. Just one example, just one example. When she asked Allah in the Quran, وَإِنِّي أُعِيدُهَا بِكَ وَذُرِّيَّتَهَا مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah 36. Surah Al-Imran, ayah 36. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you to protect her or it, the child, and their offspring from shaitan, the accursed. What happened? Was that answered? Yes. Ulama, they mentioned the hadith, and we didn't get to mention it, but we might as well mention it now. قال عليه الصلاة والسلام that ما من بني آدم مولود إلا يمسه الشيطان حين يولد. There's not a single human being, except that when they're born, shaitan, he pokes the child. فيستهل صارخا بمس الشيطان. And the child then begins to cry due to the shaitan's poke or the shaitan's touch. And this is what we say as Muslims. We believe there's more than one reason for when a child cries when they're first born. And there's no contradiction between the material and the spiritual means. It's very important. There's some people, may Allah subhanahu to open their mind and heart, they don't seem to understand these things. Right? They say, how can it be when science says a child is just trying to breathe and they're going to their mother and this and that? Yeah, that's a physical means. Is there any contradiction between a physical and spiritual means? No. Right? Surah Al-Imran, chapter 3, verse 36. That's the ayah. So how does Maryam's mother dua work? غير مريم وابنها. Right? So Maryam's mother, because she asked Allah to protect both Maryam and her offspring, Isa, Shaitan, he could not poke them when they were born. And one riwayah, the hadith, so interesting. Look what it says. One version of the hadith says, ذهب يطعنه. Shaitan tried. Hadith Bukhari. Shaitan tried to poke them. فطعن في الحجاب. But he ended up poking the veil. What's the veil here? He did, one interpretation is he tried to poke the child, and he ended up poking the cloth or the blanket where the child was in. Maryam and Isa when they first born, and he wasn't able to get to their skin. Another meaning is, he tried to poke them, but he couldn't physically poke them. He ended up poking the placenta or something like this. It's very interesting. And the fact that he tried to, he couldn't because dua prevented. This is what I'm trying to highlight. So Maryam's mother making this dua, Surah Al-Imran, chapter 3, verse 36, and then the Hadith Bukhari telling us that Shaitan tried to poke them and couldn't. Imagine, she's just born. Dua is already affecting. Imagine all the duas a mother and father can make from 0 to 1. Right? So very important during this period, lots of dua. At the very least, right, you want to make sure that you're not missing any kind of opportunity to ask Allah to bless the child. And we'll talk more about that, inshallah, in the next class, right, about how do you do that and what are some and more, and document all these examples. But what we notice is, coming back to the point I was trying to make initially, was the developmental advice Ibn Qayyim gives, alongside the advice he gives in relation to the spiritual and the religious well-being of a child. So a parent should be conscious of both. When the child is very, very young, they try to make sure that they're doing their best to fulfill the amana, their responsibility, to get the child to reach all the milestones that they should. Of course, there should also not be any pressure on the parents to hasten or to compare, right? Because that's also dangerous. Right? Each of their own. Allah subhanahu created each child differently. Some reach these milestones faster, some later. But as the mother and father are worrying on this, they should also be doing lots of preparation for the religious and spiritual one, because as you mentioned, that's an amana as well. That the reason why we're doing this series is really to talk about how we can avoid falling short in that side of things. Because for the most part, parents are doing great work and trying their best to keep their children healthy, well, right, safe. When it comes to the other side, the tarbiyah that we're talking about here, the tarbiyah we keep talking about, that part needs to be emphasized as well, starting from the beginning. Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu qu anfusakum wa ahlikum nar. All you who believe, save yourselves and family from the hellfire. Inshallah, we'll end with this much for now. I want to mention just two things, right? Two resources that parents can use. Inshallah ta'ala. Just a second, let me just close this, and I will take the questions then also.